You're listening to CinePunked. I'm your host, Robert J. E. Simpson. This episode, Bring Up a New Kind of Monster. This episode was recorded live at Octocon in Dublin in October 2018. Any variance in the audio levels and quality is reflective of the nature of the live recording. We're CinePunked. I'm Robert J. Simpson, and this is Dr. Rachael Kelly.
It's really, really pretentious if I do it, so that's why I get you to do it.
That's how we do it all the time.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do, we're recording this one for a podcast. We have a podcast series as well. So we're going to kind of talk a lot between ourselves, and we'll open up the questions and comments as well. Because we're recording it for podcast, what we'll do is we'll move around with the microphone. So basically, unless you've got the microphone in your hand, you can kind of hold back the comments, because otherwise we won't pick it up. And that's really, really difficult for our podcast editor, who then shouts at me for not having recorded it properly. Podcast editor is his brother, so he can really shout at him.
He will, yeah, he's allowed to, because he's earned the privilege by being younger. So this is CinePunked, Bring Up a New Kind of Monster. And description: Rocky Horror Picture Show, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, Young Frankenstein. In the mid-1970s, Mary Shelley's most famous creation saw a new lease of life and a radical makeover. Join CinePunk's Robert J. Simpson and Dr. Rachael Kelly for an interactive discussion about cinematic homage, parody, and reworking, and monsters in stilettos. So that is us. I suppose we probably should introduce ourselves properly. So, Rachael, introduce yourself to the group.
Introduce myself. Okay. So I'm Rachael Kelly. I've been doing CinePunked with Robert for about 3 years now. My background is in actually historical epics, toga epics, but my love of films is firmly rooted in science fiction. So this is kind of Frankenstein has become our thing this year for obvious reasons. We're talking a lot about Frankenstein, but we haven't really talked yet about reworkings of Frankenstein. We've talked about the films that have tried to be fairly faithful to it. So I think is very, very interesting, the way it gets reworked at this period.
So I'm Robert J. Simpson. I'm a film and cultural historian, and I used to work for Hammer Films, which is probably part of the reason why Hammer keeps on cropping up in these things as best as possible. And I'm a huge Rocky Horror fan and a Mel Brooks fan, so I very deliberately steered this today to talk about films that I like.
So I'm still paying back for the day I made him watch The Room. We did a podcast on The Room, you know, that absolute masterpiece by Tommy Wiseau. So basically every time he says, we're doing this film because you made me watch The Room, I have to go, right, fine.
But, you know, it's Rocky Horror at least.
Yeah,
a bit,
exactly.
So, you know, we're fine with that.
We're fine with that, yeah. I'm fine with Rocky Horror. I'll talk about Rocky Horror any day.
So, there is this weird thing in the 1970s. These are 3 films that basically came out within roughly about a year and a half, 2 years of each other. I think in production order, it's Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell first, which is Hammer's last Frankenstein film. Then it's Mel Brooks' parody Young Frankenstein. And then it's Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Yeah, but the timeline's slightly muddied, of course, by the fact that Rocky Horror pre-existed the film as a... But not by very much, though. Yes, no. We were talking about this before, so it's a slightly muddy timeline, particularly given how long it took Frankenstein the Monster from Hell to go from production to release. But yeah, all around about a year and a half of each other.
So I'm going to ask, to just gauge the audience, have you seen all 3 of these films? It's very simple. Hands in the air if you've seen Frankenstein the Monster from Hell.
Oh, you should see it.
Young Frankenstein? Slightly more. Okay. Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Of course.
Sir, have you seen any of these films?
They're infamous, I guess.
Infamous. Okay. Well, hopefully we can encourage you to watch them before the end of today's session, because I think...
Yeah, so there's some of the most... Well, okay, I will freely admit, and I'm prepared to get things thrown at me for this, I'm not a massive Mel Brooks fan. I don't think Young Frankenstein is his finest work. I think Blazing Saddles is sublime, and all the rest of them are mostly lukewarm. But I think it's the one, well, no, maybe I'm being unfair, but I think it's the one that is the most referential out of all of them. Blazing Saddles, I am being unfair because Blazing Saddles is massively referential and meta, but it's the one that most rewards having seen the film that it's parodying, I think.
When we first talked about this, you hadn't seen some of the other Frankenstein films, but over the last couple of years, we've watched a lot of them.
Well, you see, I'm not you. I don't have a kind of obsessive knowledge of Hammer.
That's Universal, really, doesn't it?
No, okay, no, Universal Frankenstein. We we've been talking about this quite a lot. Universal Frankenstein is kind of the source for what most people tend to know about Frankenstein. We're about to do this with a group of 17, 18-year-olds, and we're about to actually ask them about Frankenstein mythology and see how much of what they know about Frankenstein actually derives from Universal's 1931 film, which I'm going to suggest about 90% of what they think of relating to Frankenstein actually comes from that film. Has everybody seen the 1931 Frankenstein? Yeah. It's great fun. It is great fun. And you thing is, once you've watched it, you'll realise, I kind of have seen this in bits and pieces all over. And even if I haven't seen the film, I've seen it referenced everywhere.
Let's actually make it even simpler. I mean, if you think about Frankenstein, what defines Frankenstein for you as an audience? Do feel free to shout out. I know we haven't got the mic at you, but like, what are the caricatures you expect of Frankenstein? Big, huge, bulgy head. Okay, yeah. Boris Karloff. Okay, yeah. What colour is Frankenstein? Grey, green, white. Oh, it's more diverse than I thought.
Yes.
Yeah. What
a lot of that basically, I mean, the sort of the big bulky, Mary Shelley's is remarkably non-descriptive about what Frankenstein actually looks like and about how it's created. It's the whole sort of hand-wavy, I can't possibly tell you in case you follow in my wicked footsteps.
Oh yeah, there is that bit in the book, isn't there? I've forgotten about that.
Yeah, so even this idea that he's created by lightning strike, that's universal. Yeah.
Yeah, the machinery is very much the Universal horror films. It's the grey or green. I mean, a lot of the kind of popular characterizations we see of it. So if you're going into the Halloween shop in Blanchardstown Mall, around the corner from here,
You've done your research.
I've done my research this week. It's lots of kind of green, bolted-necked kind of Frankenstein monster creations, and that is all driven either from the Universal film or any of the merchandising that came out as a result of the Universal film. And that I think is the image that we still have, and that filters through likes the monsters and and all those other adaptations. That's what we still think of, but the character itself is more complex. Now, Young Frankenstein is essentially Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder's homage to Universal's films.
It's more Gene Wilder's homage to Universal's films, isn't it? I think this is going to be our big argument of the afternoon.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think it's collectively. I mean, obviously it's a partnership, but it's Gene Wilder essentially, and then Mel Brooks' direction. So much of a homage that it actually includes some of the original laboratory equipment from the Universal films. You can't really get any more authentic than that. We're creating the monster by the same means possible.
But it's sort of, correct me if it revitalizes the mythology, doesn't it? I mean, I think this is really, really interesting that at this particular moment, and not really anywhere else in the kind of the reproduction of the Frankenstein mythology, do we get these very kind of playful postmodern takes. I mean, there's lots of different engagements with that mythology, and there's lots of kind of updating of the mythology, and there's lots of kind of making it more relevant to the current audience. But I mean, these two particular films, Frankenstein, Young Frankenstein and Rocky Horror, are reworking playfully I hesitate to use this word because I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but in a very postmodern sense. Yeah, I know. Shall we let that be the only mention of the P word? Yeah.
Where's the academia, Rachael?
I know. But here, and this is what why here? Why at this particular point? Because Frankenstein has been incredibly successful for Hammer up to this point. Frankenstein in the truest sense, Frankenstein as in the doctor and not the monster.
There is, I suppose, this point where by the 1970s, the characters themselves had been on screen for 40 years. Universal's Frankenstein's 1930. And
longer than that. I mean, Frankenstein...
Edison's Frankenstein's 1910.
I know, it goes back to the very earliest days of cinema,
But if we're thinking about kind of people's popular impressions, it's the Universal films, which are around for 40 years at that point, and have gone to the point already of parody with their kind of monster mash kind of films and the Abbott and Costello versions. And it's been filtered through a couple other things, but by the 1970s, we've also got television in everyone's homes, and the monster films have actually become part and parcel of what people are digesting at night.
Yes.
The number of times, I don't know if anyone here is old enough to have watched a lot of these films in the 70s, sort of on TV late at night. I mean, they were on screens in Ireland, in the UK, in Britain. We've just done a recording about Halloween. You know, if you watch the original Halloween, they're watching monster movies on TV.
They are not this one.
Not
though.
this one, but they are
Yeah,
watching
they
monster
are,
movies.
yeah.
So I mean, this is very much the part and parcel of the entertainment. So it's what you kind of grow up with, and so that naturally lends itself to parody and homage.
So it's kind of an outpouring then of the new Hollywood
It's
movement.
nostalgia.
Yeah.
I think
Okay. Well,
I
that's
think-
new Hollywood. It's nostalgia.
yeah.
That's where that comes from. That comes from being sort of cinema literate from your early childhood, and that kind of engagement, that meta engagement. So maybe in that sense, then the 1970s kind of the ideal time for it to happen.
These are 3 films about nostalgia. So take Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell. This is the last of Hammer's Frankenstein films.
It's got Darth Vader as Frankenstein, by the way. That's the one thing you need to know about this. Yeah, watch it for this reason alone. Darth Vader is Frankenstein's monster.
It's Darth Vader and Grand Moff Tarkin.
Yes, it is.
So I mean, this is very much a precursor to George Lucas's stuff.
I'm sure that's probably where he got his ideas from.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, it's Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, and it's probably the only real instance I can think of within the series where the monster is very clearly, grotesquely a monster.
Yes.
It's almost beyond recognition as a human being.
But it's not really the Frankenstein mythos, except in as much as it's become very much about reanimating dead matter, which is not actually
Yeah.
Shelley's Frankenstein.
No, not at all. And at this point, I mean, Hammer have developed that series themselves. Frankenstein, as played by Peter Cushing, is really the focus of the kind of the horror within the films. He's someone who's taken that power and that creation. And actually, by the second film, I don't know, anyone know Revenge of Frankenstein? No, the Hammer film. So by Revenge of Frankenstein, Frankenstein has actually recreated himself in a new body.
Oh, yeah.
So he is indeed the monster by the end of the second film in Hammer's franchise.
Doesn't that just make things a lot easier? You don't have to have the argument anymore. You know, which one's Frankenstein? Well, they're both Frankenstein in this film.
Yeah. So he's gone and done all these things, and this is very much sort of an extreme. But in some respects, it's quite nice. It is a homage to Hammer's films. It's once again, you've got, in terms of cast, you've got Cushing back as kind of the creator. Patrick Troughton is the grave robber. So second Doctor in Doctor Who.
Yeah.
He'd also been the grave robber in the first film, although his scene was largely cut from the final film. So he's back as well. You've got Terence Fisher directing for the last time, who again had directed all of Hammer's kind of main horror films. This is a nice little kind of coda to Hammer's horror series.
And isn't Darth Vader, he's the only person to have played the monster twice
Apparently so.
in the Hammer series.
In the
anyway.
Hammer series, yeah, I mean, because obviously Karloff had done it more than once.
Oh, well, yes, I mean, yes,
You know,
in the
he's-
Hammer series.
Yeah, in the Hammer series, yeah. But then, so that is a homage. Young Frankenstein is very clearly a homage to the Universal
Yes.
films. A very affectionate, very knowing, but it's still quite a loving homage, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you actually can't have really good parody unless there's love involved. Otherwise, it becomes poking fun at. And
Well, let's come back to that theme of love.
okay,
Yep.
all right. I sense another argument brewing.
and then you get to Rocky Horror Picture Show, which is again a homage not just to Hammer and to Universal, but basically to all monster movies.
Yeah, well, it is a love letter to science fiction B movies since the beginning of Richard O'Brien's life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And very notably, the Hammer Frankenstein, there's that wonderful shot. So most of us know Rocky Horror Picture Show. There's that wonderful sequence very early on where they're coming up to the castle, and there's that line about there's a light over at the Frankenstein place, and you see Richard O'Brien at the window. Literally in the window of the Hammer Frankenstein place. This is back at Oakley Court. This is back at Bray Studios. They are shooting in the same place that Hammer did and had not long left. In terms of homages, this is again very, very knowing. And if you know the stuff, it is just a big tribute to those earlier films.
It rewards knowledge, which is again, that again is kind of for me sort of part of the most successful parody and the most successful homage. It rewards pre-knowledge of it, so that as fans we can go, oh, I'm so clever, I saw that, I got that.
Yeah, we kind of think of that.
Nobody else watch films like me, no. Yes, thank you.
I have this lovely idea sometime to actually sit down and do a little film festival. It's all based on science fiction double feature as a song. And we just basically go through and we watch each of the films that Richard O'Brien references in that sequence.
Oh, who's in? Yes, let's make this happen.
Come to Belfast. But I think it bridges the two as well. I mean, so Young Frankenstein's Universal, Frankenstein Monster from Hell is obviously Hammer, but this sort of goes between the two, and there's elements of both. And it takes it somewhere else as well.
Well, I think, to me, the kind of gender bending of Rocky Horror feels true to the novel in a way that I haven't really seen elsewhere. I mean, there's various degrees of faithfulness in the cinematic engagements with Frankenstein, the novel. Who's seen Kenneth Branagh's effort? Yeah.
One or two.
I don't hate it. I admire what it was trying to do. It got completely sidetracked by being a 90s film, and it is so painfully 90s that it's almost unwatchable to an audience that hasn't come up in the 90s, I think. So again, we're going to be talking about this with 17, 18-year-olds in the next few weeks, and that'll be really interesting. It branded itself on its fidelity to the original story. Now, that's a huge question. I don't want to get too sidetracked by this one because it's not one of the films we're talking about. But in fact, it inverts a really key part of the mythology, which is that instead of being Frankenstein's attempt to usurp the power of creation, a man attempting to usurp the power of creation from women, it becomes a man attempting to conquer death, which is a very different thing. It's not what Shelley was doing at all. It's very specifically not what Shelley was doing. And so the gender bending of Rocky Horror, I think, is actually, it's much more true to that kind of gender discourse. Sorry, I'm going to stop saying really annoying academic-y things.
Like gender.
But, like gender discourse, yeah, I know. I can just feel everybody going, oh, I'm going to punch her for that. That's terrible. But that kind of, what Shelley's doing, that kind of discussion of, well, gender, yeah, and that kind of the playfulness with which Rocky Horror kind of inverts gender norms. I think that feels very true to what Shelley. I think Shelley would have approved of Rocky Horror.
And yeah, that's something that kind of comes up in the Universal films very early on. I mean, that's Bride of Frankenstein, 35.
Are you going to claim that Universal was gender bending in 1931? Because if you are, I'm going to demand evidence. Citations
not by
needed.
1931, but certainly by 1935 when they do Bride of Frankenstein. I mean, which, you've got that. Certainly, they're playing up with the gender stereotypes much more overtly, suggesting that this is something. I mean, this is a film that's a film that is all about a creature that is created without a mother figure. You got to Ernest Thessinger's Dr. Pretorius sitting in his little room with his little vials full of people, and that kind of there is a homoerotic subtext that's often picked up on in that film. I mean, subtext
yes.
is kind of pretty.
It's less subtext and more kind of text.
Yeah.
But is that the whole James Whale?
I think it probably is James Whale's influence on it. But it does show that the Frankenstein series, even within mainstream Hollywood, has already kind of taken issue with this and is playing with it from very early on.
Okay.
Possibly for another podcast, but
Okay, I'm not sure how far I agree with that. I think part of, well, I suppose they're products of their time. They're slightly pre-Hays Code, but they're still very much of the period where Hays Code mores were required. I'm not sure how much I would buy into that, but I mean, I don't think Rocky Horror is kind of in your face about it. It's kind of the whole thing.
Well, while we're talking about in your face and we've mentioned love, can we talk about the
Where
issues?
are we going with this?
The issues of consent and
Yes.
within these films, because rewatching them this week, it strikes me that basically the creations, the monsters, are there as sexual tools as much as anything else within each of these films.
Yeah, well, I think the words you used earlier on was all of these films are a bit rapey.
They're incredibly rapey.
Yeah. They are
to
all
the point where they actually all explicitly, well, two of them certainly explicitly reference the rape, and
Yes.
one alludes to it very strongly.
Okay, so hang on, which ones are we going for as explicit? Because I think they're all pretty explicit about it.
Well, Frankenstein the Monster from Hell actually uses
Yes.
rape as a term, which is
Yes.
Quite unusual in terms
I
of...
was surprised, yeah. But, I mean, okay, so actual rape attempted rape has taken place in the backstory of that film. So it's against this kind of sexual lack of consent. The whole story is placed.
And then you have a creature that is the product of somebody's brilliant mind, which of course goes back to the original story anyway, placed inside this monstrous creation, which he doesn't agree with clearly. And then Frankenstein has this weird notion where he's going to reproduce from the monster with the girl who is already deeply suffering from post-traumatic stress, having been the victim of an attempted rape by her father.
Yeah.
And he says this is what he's going to do, which brings up the kind of the rush to the end of the film and kind of the decision to undo the monster's creation.
Yeah. So we've got the sort of the dubious consent in Rocky Horror, so which legally it is rape what Frankenfurter does,
Yes.
achieving sex by duplicity, and yeah, so I was very, very uncomfortable. Now everybody's familiar with Young Frankenstein, didn't we say mostly? The sequence where the monster kidnaps Elizabeth, takes her out to the forest because he quite fancies a shag with her, and she is definitely not up for it.
Yeah, Madeline Kahn spent the entire film going, no, not Taffeta, darling, Taffeta.
But
Taffeta,
right
darling.
up to the point where she sees that he has an enormous penis. And then all of a sudden she's like, oh, cool, let's do this 7 times. Now that's deeply problematic for all kinds of reasons. But yeah, I mean...
Yeah, and the last bit of the film is, you've all, a spoiler for a 40-year-old film, can we do that? Yeah?
You should still
it's
see
worth
them,
watching.
yeah.
So by the end of the film, you've got this point where they basically tried to almost kind of switch brains between the creature and Frankenstein and try and normalize the creature. But something
it's
goes
kind of hand-wavy science fiction things. We'll just connect their brains together and everything will be fine.
fine to work. But as they're doing that, there is a problem. The villagers rush in and the process goes wrong. So the creature ends up becoming super intelligent and articulate and responsible. And the question is then asked, so Inga ends up getting with Frankenstein, so the maid ends up getting with Frankenstein, and they're in the bedroom, because they've now married as well, because this is what happens. And she says to him, well, I understand what he got from you, what did you get from him? And he just sits there in passive silence, and then the lights dim, she makes a number of noises that sound very unconsensual, followed by the kind of the singing of joy, and it's like clearly, okay, so he started basically raping her and she's gone with it. That's the only way I can read that scene. And that's how the film ends.
Yeah.
Well, Marty Feldman blowing his horn.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I would have read that sequence quite as rapily as that.
She's not consenting at the first.
Well,
This
God.
was-
Okay,
this-
you're going to make me say, but they're married, and then I'm going to be a total rape apologist, and it's going to be dreadful. Okay, I'm not going there.
But I mean, that's the very thing that got Straw Dogs banned. There's a sequence in Straw Dogs where she ends up having sex. It's a rapey kind of situation, and she is accosted by someone who is a former partner. But nonetheless, there is still it's still essentially a rape sequence, and she seemed to enjoy it, and that was not permissible. And yet somehow, because this is framed within comedy, we still have this thing where in comedy today,
comedy, yes, it's horrendous. Yeah, comedy you can get away with all kinds, particularly if the target is male. I mean, this is 40-something-year-old comedy, so it's not quite as progressed to the point where it's not seen as acceptable for women. But yeah, comedy is terrible for pretending that it's somehow okay if it's funny.
So is it because these are monsters that we can accept this kind of behaviour? I mean, literally, they are monsters, they are creations. So because you've got that distance from them and us as people, is it then acceptable to have your creation be as impulsive and, I guess, animalistic as they possibly can?
Well, the monster, the original monster, Shelley's monster, is a sexual being. I mean, that's kind of the whole reason why his vengeance is so terrible, because his sexual drive is thwarted. Frankenstein refuses to build him a mate.
bride.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess all these films are about having a bride of some sort, which I don't know, you thought about kind of how the bride is used in these before, because essentially you're coupling up Sarah and Monster from Hell. We've got 2 brides in Young Frankenstein.
Yeah.
And, well, Brad and Janet are newlyweds.
Yeah, Rocky is made to be a bride.
Well, he's made to be fucked, let's be
Yes,
honest.
yeah.
That is his entire purpose.
That is his entire purpose. And he's okay with it because he has those kind of, those sexual urges. He's been grown to have these sexual urges. It's just that they don't necessarily point in the direction that Frankenfurter wants them to.
Yeah, but when we're talking about Rocky is seen as such a simplistic, childlike creature. It's so creepy.
But yeah, he sings an actual song about my libido hasn't been controlled. How he just likes to come all the time. That's Rocky's thing. So yeah, it's again, if you actually unpick it, you start to go, oh no, that's not okay. But he on the surface is kind of like built to be up for it. God, actually, why do I like this film so much? That's awful.
Every time we talk about this, it's more and more problematic.
Oh dear, yeah. Oh, this is going to be Blade Runner all over again, isn't it? I'm going to be forced to interact with how difficult one of my favourite things is.
But we sit there, and the reality is we sit there. It's one of the most popular musicals around. It tours constantly. We go and watch that. We sit there and we love it, and we laugh. And we laugh about the fact that these characters are kind of transgressing each other. They're abusing each other, that they're non-consensually getting their kicks off each other. And it's not, I mean, it's masked in sort of gender bending, but it's not. It's actually something that's far more creepy and sinister, to the point where, you know, the audience sits in most screenings and most versions of the musical shouting out that Janet is a slut.
Yes.
And we're kind of, we're actually literally slut shaming.
Yes.
As we watch these things.
Yes, yeah. Wow, okay. So for our next one, we will start ruining Bambi.
She's a bad mother.
Oh, yeah. Was there a question? I thought there was, yes, did you want to?
Let me bring a microphone to you so we can pick it up.
Yeah, bring that.
Rachel will argue now this is the bit I love best because I wander around with a microphone.
So now you have enabled his thing where he goes out to the audience and
see, we got one that's long. This is longish. Would you like to come over to the microphone? Just for the podcast.
What about the movie I, Frankenstein? I know it has its whole plethora of problems, but Frankenstein doesn't come across as a sexual being in that movie. Well,
I
it's
still
not to me
haven't
anyway.
seen it, I've got to be honest. I haven't seen I, Frankenstein yet.
No, I haven't seen I, Frankenstein either. That's not one that I am aware of. So he's not a sexual being in that one.
Well, he's not trying to fuck anybody.
Okay.
Often Frankenstein isn't trying to fuck anybody, but he is trying sometimes to get other people to do it. He's quite rapey by distance.
Yeah, no, this one doesn't come across as...
Interesting, we're going to
He
have to
comes
see
across as a sexual-ish to me.
Okay. Curiously, I mean, there's in Hammer's series, there's always a bit that's picked up in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, where he rapes Veronica Carlson's character. And it was always said that this was a last-minute addition on the part of the producers, but it actually always feels to me like it fits very much in keeping with how much of a bastard Frankenstein actually is in that series.
Yeah, no, he's that one in particular. I think he sort of goes in and out of bastardliness in that series, but that's the one, isn't it, where he is just the particularly
he's
despicably awful.
Absolutely, but
But that's not the monster, though.
No, that's him. That's actually him.
Himself, yeah.
But in the Curse of Frankenstein, there is a point where he's clearly clearly abuses his power, and he is a sexual being because he's got the maid pregnant. What he then goes and does is he puts the maid in with the creature, and the suggestion I've always taken is very much that the creature's going to have his wicked way with her and then kill her. So you get it all happens off screen because it's 1956. But nevertheless, that's always how I've read that. So Frankenstein from the start in Hammer series has been a complete git, to put it nicely.
Well, that's why you hire Peter Cushing, isn't it, to be fabulously creepy.
Yeah, so you love the git.
Yeah.
Well, at the same time, you also got that lovely thing where Peter Cushing is not only playing the absolute git and bastard in Frankenstein, but he's also playing the ultimate hero in Van Helsing in the Dracula series. And you've got the two coexisting side by side.
But one thing we haven't added it to our list of films that we were going to discuss today, but it's of the same sort of period as Flesh for Frankenstein. Do we want to go there?
I haven't seen that in so long. I kind of deliberately, when I was drawing up this list, avoided putting it on.
Shall we avoid talking? Because, I mean, that's not even about... That's about, you know, Frankenstein himself being kind of... Well, let's just... fairly definitely sexually deviant. There's incestuous relationships. There's humping open wounds before your man ever got the idea to do that in mainstream cinema. It's, yeah, I mean, it's...
Well, we save that for another time.
Yeah, we saved that for another time, yeah. Is anybody familiar with that one?
It's Andy Warhol, Paul Nash, isn't it?
I wouldn't. You know, you can live your life fairly happily without that one, I think.
Yep. So microphone's just at the front there. You want to grab it? Sorry, we're making you do some work now as well. It's just a call that I could.
I just wanted to kind of think about Peter Cushing being like a bad guy, some worse than others. There was another Hammer horror film he was in, Twins of Evil,
Yeah.
which I saw at a festival a couple of years ago, where he's absolutely horrible and he kind of goes around killing witches with no proof. But the good guy of the film actually has a conversation with his wife about, well, he's a good man, really. He's just a bit misguided and he goes around murdering people. I was wondering, is this? I remember watching this. I know it's 1972. It was like, is that okay with people? Yeah, he's horrible. He's behind it all. He's really nice. And is that kind of where they were going with Frankenstein? Kind of like he's a good guy behind it all, even though he's doing some horrible things.
I think, quite honestly, if you look at the way that the world is today, I mean, we're from Belfast, so it's not that far away from you guys down here in lovely Dublin. People are like that in real life. You will get people excusing bad behaviour because they're generally a good person, because they, as Gustav Weil in Twins of Evil does, he's a good church attendant, he's in charge, he's a responsible figure, he's like the moral guardian, so therefore anything he does, while he may be a bit overzealous, it's kind of acceptable. And we still do that.
Yeah, I do also think that's kind of a fundamentally Frankenstein-y thing. Because the story is told from Frankenstein's first-person perspective, there is a lot of sympathy for me, poor me. Why on earth does the world hate me? All I ever did was create life where God had decreed that no life should exist and then abandon it to suffer miserably and die horribly on its own. Why does everyone hate me for that? So I mean, there is that kind of tension in the original character about where we are given such a lot of insight into his very, as he sees it, good reasons why this is something that should and needs to be done, and then obviously he has this complete change of heart, and for the good of all mankind he refuses to sort of propagate further evil. So there is a tension in the character himself whereby we can look at it from the outside and go, just that thing the exact thing you said, Frankenstein, that's why everyone hates you, don't do that and you'll be fine. But we are invited to have a certain level of sympathy for him. I mean, he's the hero of the story. We are given insight into his motivation more than we are given insight into anyone else's, with the partial exception of the monster. And we are invited to view the monster from Frankenstein's perspective anyway, which is fairly anti. So in many ways, he is like the tragic hero of the piece. So for all these things that he does that we can look at and go, actually, that's really not okay. Victor, don't do that. We are invited to sympathise with him. So I think that's probably fairly true. And I think with the possible exception of that one film in the Hammer Frankenstein oeuvre, I think there's a tension in that character as well, whereby he is incredibly sympathetic, sometimes certainly compared to a lot of the characters he's up against, while also being just despicable and
Well, when you look at a lot of the actors that have ended up playing Dr. Frankenstein or Victor Frankenstein, whatever variation of the name you want to give him.
Henry Frankenstein,
Frederick Frankenstein.
Frederick Frankenstein.
When you've got characters like that, I mean, the actors that play them, they are often quite charismatic in their own right. So, in terms of sort of stardom and the way
they're the romantic lead.
Yeah. We kind of go on board that, they've got charisma, they've got charm. We kind of go along with them quite a bit, which we probably also do in real life. It's like politicians are a really good example of this. You got a nice, smarmy, charming politician, you're kind of going to buy more of their shit than you are if someone is physically and mentally reprehensible. So we kind of, although we kind of dislike some of what Gene Wilder's Froderick is doing, we kind of quite like Gene Wilder as Froderick, so we kind of run along with him.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's unhinged, but he's lovably unhinged. He's Gene Wilder unhinged. Which, yeah, that's adorable, isn't it?
It helps.
That face he does.
It helps that he's got Marty Feldman's Igor to kind of push him along through it. You don't like Igor?
No, I have very, very limited patience. That mugging to camera thing just winds me up. The hump thing, I like the hump thing. I thought that was good.
You know he can't help his eyes.
That's not what I mean.
That's a
You're gonna
thyroid
make me
condition.
sound so awful on this podcast. I am not slagging off his eyes. It's the kind of the turning to camera and going, ha ha ha, here is my funny joke. I am the comic relief. Ha 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 ha.
But then that's also breaking down the fourth wall. I mean, there's something we are along on Young Frankenstein with it.
Yeah,
for
no,
the-
I know, but
and they
I
break
think-
down the wall on Rocky Horror too.
Yes, I think it's breaking down the wall is done much more successfully when it's done with a knowing wink that is largely implied, rather than literally turning to the camera and winking and going, "Ha! Aren't we so daring, breaking the fourth wall?" But they break the fourth wall in Blazing Saddles as well, but they do it much
Quite.
more successfully. You know, I think
You're just against Young Frankenstein.
I am kind of against Young Frankenstein. I think Mel Brooks, when Mel Brooks is sublime, he's sublime, but he's very rarely sublime. Throw things at me now if you like.
Audience, any comments, thoughts? You're more than welcome to. No. So where were they going with the Frankenstein at this point? I mean, that's kind of the object that we set ourselves out is what is happening at this point in time. That
What is happening at this point in time, and only at this point in time?
he doesn't seem to have been quite so transgressive. They haven't been quite so exploratory
they kind of revert
since.
to type, don't they? And in fact, there's quite a long period of not very much Frankenstein after the kind of the mid 70s. I mean, it's kind of sporadic here and there. It only really picks up again in the 80s. Moving us swiftly through to that masterpiece of cinematic exuberance.
Frankenstein Unbound.
Not that one. I will defend Branagh's Frankenstein. I will defend what it was trying to do. And in fact, the script that nearly was apparently bloody brilliant. Del Toro's still, as far as I know, talking about picking that script up again.
I mean, the issue with Branagh's Frankenstein is not that it's not. It's fine that it's faithful.
It's Kenneth Branagh faithful.
It's unrelenting. It has no variation in pace.
But it's 1990s. That's how they made films in the 1990s.
I was on a panel yesterday morning, and they some of the guys were talking about this in terms of Frankenstein, and they were saying lots of praise for it, which was quite unusual because we've been a little bit more critical of it.
You have.
But they really liked its kind of authenticity, and I just don't think it's enough to be authentic. You still have to remember these are films, and you have to be dramatic and have to do something different.
Yes, and the book itself it's an early 19th century novel. It doesn't really adhere to the same beats that we're used to. So
It's a confessional, isn't it? The book itself is it's Frankenstein's confession as to what he'd done.
yeah, I suppose. I'm not convinced he really thinks that he deserved what he got.
No,
Yeah.
but it is nevertheless him telling his story. And,
And
kind of like,
considering
this
it's
is what
not
I've done.
actually him that got a lot of what went wrong, you know, everybody else dies except for him, and he's like, "Oh, woe is me."
Yeah.
I have very little sympathy for Victor Frankenstein. I find him whiny emo git. Just why poor me? It's like, yeah, okay, your wife was literally strangled to death on your wedding night, but that's somehow poor you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm getting sidetracked by my antipathy for Victor Frankenstein.
I mean, quite weirdly, Hammer's first Frankenstein is essentially a confessional too. It's him about to go to the hangman's noose, telling his story. So there is a kind of reference back to that sort of literary form of the
Yeah.
book itself. But weirdly, by the end of that series, by the end of Frankenstein Monster from Hell, even though there's been an attempt to take away the power from him, you've got him sitting at the end of that film saying, "Oh, okay, right, so this is what I did wrong this time. Next time, I'm going to do it like this, and it's going to be so much better."
Yeah, and very often the cinematic Frankensteins end up being the romantic hero, actually getting the girl, despite the fact that, you know, everything they have done has put the woman in danger all the way through, and very often she's seen as a sort of a sacrifice to the overall goal.
I suppose weirdly, actually, Rocky Horror is the only one where Frankenstein gets his comeuppance. By the end, essentially, I mean, Frankenfurter is penalised.
But I've seen shows where that it's done much more kind of joyously, and he goes to his death with a big smile on his face, fabulous to the end. I think the film actually treats that with the horror that I think it actually deserves.
With that very melancholy number and the whole summing around and kind of ending up in a weird kind of...
Yeah, no. The actual sort of it is horrific when he's trying to escape from Riff Raff and Magenta, who are basically coming to execute him. and they tell him, we're about to execute you, and he screams and panics and tries to escape.
Yeah.
It's brutal. It's brutal, and I think a lot of the shows, in fact most of the shows I've seen, have not seen that as a brutal, horrific moment, even though this film is a love letter to sort of B-movie horror and B-movie science fiction. So yeah, he does get a comeuppance, but I'm not sure that his comeuppance, in fact his comeuppance is not for creating Rocky. His comeuppance...
Oh, it's revenge on Riff Raff and Magenta's part more than anything else, isn't it?
But they specifically state that it's his lifestyle that has caused the mission to fail.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not the same thing. He's not, the punishment is not for creating Rocky. The creating Rocky is kind of a manifestation of this extreme lifestyle that he's living, which is, it kind of undermines a lot of that sort of gleeful freedom that that kind of alternative sexuality is given all the way through. I mean, it's very sinister. It's a sinister alternative sexuality, but then the sort of counterpart to that, Brad and Janet, is not presented as desirable at all. That kind of staid, straight-laced, kind of saving oneself for marriage, that is not presented as something that one would want. And the liberation that Frank allows them to experience is presented as being beneficial, although not ultimately for their relationship, obviously.
Whose eyes are we looking at Rocky Horror through, though? Which is maybe the question, because...
That is a good question.
I suspect it's Riff Raff and Magenta, most of it. It has to be, because they're there right from the start. They're at the wedding.
In the film?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I suppose we are looking specifically at the film, aren't we?
Yeah, I mean, they are there right from the start of that show. They're right at the end of it.
Yeah.
They outlast the decadence and everything else.
Yeah.
So it can't be Frankenfurter, and it can't be Brad and Janet, because the way that it looks at their relationship.
Is it that kind of very women in film noir type of morality where it's, must punish women for transgressing the social boundaries, but we'll watch her have enormous fun doing it for 85 minutes of the 90-minute runtime, but definitely not good to do that die at the end. Do you think?
Quite possibly. I don't think there's anyone who comes out of Rocky Horror with any kind of sense of...
Careful here, because lots of people come out of Rocky Horror with a great deal of sense of I must go and wear fishnet tights.
Yeah.
Because a lot of them have got in with a sense of I must wear fishnet tights in a basque.
I've had this right with Patricia Quinn myself.
Yes, he is friends with Patricia Quinn. He's just name dropping now.
We could talk about this. I think the film is obviously quite important in many respects in terms of that, but that's a whole different debate. But I don't think that any of the forms of relationship within that film come away unchecked. I think there's criticism leveled at every single aspect of it. Ultimately, if for nothing else, on the issue of consent.
Yes, and that is the big problem there, isn't it, with that kind of freedom? I mean, it's implied that actually Brad and Janet kind of once they have kind of rapily been divested of their virginity, they kind of sort of they're cool with it and they're on board with it, and it's kind of like an awakening for them. But they would not have chosen to do that, either of them. Mm-hmm.
Which is the same point that Frankenstein makes in Monster from Hell, where he's sort of suggesting that Sarah will be completely okay with being raped by the monster because there's a greater good.
Yes.
And even though that's what's put her into that kind of mute state that she sits in.
That's all we ask for, isn't it, ladies? We just ask to be part of the greater good. That's all we consider. Yeah.
So we've got about a minute or two. If anyone has any other comments, thoughts, queries, or just wants to tell us that we're talking out of our asses. Gentleman over there with the glasses looks like he wants to say that.
There's a lady at the front here also.
Oh, yes. Grab the mic.
You've talked about 3 specific films, but are there any Frankenstein films that you've seen that actually gives you sympathy for the monster?
Yeah, I think most of them, if they're being faithful to the film, faithful in any way to the book. The monster is broadly sympathetic. Karloff's monster, before he learns to speak, he's childlike and is kind of, his complete lack of understanding of anything, and the fact that he is violent is very much framed as not his fault. I think De Niro's monster as well, he's De Niro, De Niro was obviously going to put massive amounts of pathos and backstory into that character. I think there are plenty, and Darth Vader, Frankenstein. Okay, Dave Price is Frankenstein's monster.
You haven't seen Horror Frankenstein yet, though, have you?
I haven't seen that one. But yeah, I think it's although the monster is definitely a bit rapey, that's not always framed as his fault. It's framed as him being put in a position whereby nobody will ever love him.
Well, he's not educated.
Well, he's self-educated.
He's self-educated,
yeah.
but he's not. No one ever sits down to tell him this is not acceptable behaviour. He's sort of let to be indulged slightly, and that's always the problem. I think that Frankenstein often indulges the monster slightly.
Indulged by abandoning him.
Yeah.
To die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think most of the films probably do present the creature as some. You do end up having sympathy. Even Christopher Lee's version in Curse of Frankenstein, it's a mute performance, but you watch him and it's all in the eyes, and you end up feeling very, very sympathetic. I think part of the problem is usually that the brain that's put into that creature's shell is from a different person, and that person nearly always rebels.
Yeah. I'm thinking of The Bride of Frankenstein as well, whereby that's Universal's follow-up to 1931's Frankenstein, and that's where you get that very iconic. I nearly cosplayed as her because she's fabulous. You get that very iconic beehive hairstyle with and although she only appears very briefly at the end, the monster's reaction when she basically she screams and is horrified by him. He says she hates me just like everyone else. And yeah, there's an enormous amount of sort of, you didn't ask for any of this, my friend, but also she literally just met you. Okay, creating her specifically to fall in love with you, and then getting annoyed because she doesn't immediately want to jump into bed with you is kind of, somebody needs to talk to you about how this works, because just because she's been created to be with you, that is basically a sex slave now, my friend. And why is it better that she's your slave than you being Frankenstein's slave? Very, very often the monster is shown as being sort of sympathetic in just his desire to have sort of sexual companionship, because it's always very heteronormative sexual companionship. Just I wonder is that a point to talk about another time? but it is framed as being this basic human desire to be loved, and if your own creator is going to reject you utterly and be horrified by you and decry the day that he ever sort of saw fit to challenge God's design for the world by creating this abomination, looking for somebody to hold your hand is not actually necessarily something that you can reject utterly as an audience member. So there is, it's very kind of, there's all sorts of issues with consent and that lack of understanding consent. But I think the main blame for the monster's transgressions kind of usually lies with Frankenstein himself as opposed to the monster, except after he sort of develops that level of understanding and says, I am deliberately now going out to kill children because you were mean to me. That's a bit more difficult to kind of hand wave away. You had a bad life, but we don't kill children. We don't do that.
Anything else very, very quickly? No? Okay, in that case, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to CinePunked, Bring Up a New Kind of Monster with Robert J.E. Simpson and Dr. Rachael Kelly. The sound was recorded at the Crown Plaza, Blanchardstown, as part of Octocon 2018. We're grateful to the organisers of the con for the invite to talk and for their help with the recording itself. For more on Octocon, visit www.octocon.com. If you've enjoyed the show, do consider leaving us a review on iTunes. You can catch up on the podcast and subscribe via your favourite podcast distributor or via our website, cinepunked.com, where you can also find out about our other activities, including upcoming live events. You can also catch up with us and interact by searching for CinePunked on Twitter and Facebook and CinePunked Film on Instagram. Until the next time, thanks for listening.